Well, it finally happened. I put my credentials in a YouTube title, even though I said a couple videos ago I didn't want to because it felt too real and too serious and I'm just a girl. But there's good reason for it today, because today I'm not talking about music. I'm talking about something else that is equally just as fun to yap about for me, and that is psychology. If you have been on my channel for like a nanosecond, literally milliseconds, you would know that I have a degree in psychology. Let me just pull this out for you really quick. What does that say? This is my degree in psychology. But yes, I have a degree in psychology, a minor in English, but as an undergrad, I was actually in something called the Accelerated Master's Program, which means I was working on a master's degree as an undergrad. So I was working on my regular degree as an undergrad, but then I was also working on a master's at the same time because my grades were good enough. And then I graduated summa cum laude, the best one, by the way, if you were wondering. Now I'm in a general psychology program, finishing up my master's. I'm going to be on a research team here shortly. I'm actually certified to give people exams that measure their cognitive abilities. I don't know, to me that just feels wrong, because if anybody needs to have a cognitive exam done, it's me. No, I shouldn't be the one giving the exam, but here we are. So yes, I know a thing or two when it comes to mental health, and so I thought that I would give this book a read, which is You Will Get Through This Night by Daniel Howell. Danny boy, Dan is not on fire, that guy, the YouTube guy. The Dan from Dan and Phil, often seen with Phil Lester, that guy. This is an older book, and I'm going to admit I put off reading it for the longest time, for a couple of reasons. Mainly because I just don't have time to read books all that often. And I'm not a huge fan of self-help books because I read enough of that in my education, and also because who it's coming from can sometimes be questionable, and how they present said information can also be questionable, and it just kind of ticks me off most of the time. And I understand there's people online with good intentions wanting to spread information, but even though it's well intended, it's still incorrect. So I kind of stay away from books like these. But because it is Dan Howell, I ultimately folded. I actually got this book the day after I met him for the second time. Younger me was actually obsessed with Dan and Phil, and much like Tyler and Josh, they will always have a special place in my heart for being one of the pillars of my childhood. So I finally gave in. I got the book and I read it. So let me give you my semi-educated opinion on it. As I said before, the book is called You Will Get Through This Night. It's by Daniel Howell, and it says A Practical Guide to Mental Health. And it is a very practical guide, I will admit. I like the way that it's set up, if that is the case. It's actually set up into 3 parts, and Dan even mentions that you can skip around depending on what part you want to go to. It's not something that you have to start from the beginning and read to the end. You could skip around if you want to. And the 3 sections, as listed on the back of the book, are: This night, learn how to manage your thoughts and feelings in tough times. Tomorrow, change your everyday habits to be healthier and happier. The days after that, understand your behavior and treat yourself with compassion to tackle life's challenges. And throughout the entire book, there's little summary paragraphs of what was just said in the chapter, as well as little exercises that again kind of summarize what he talks about in the actual chapter part. There's little bullet lists that are pretty neat, and there's also these black pages throughout the book. I understand if you're just flipping through this and kind of using it as a guide, a quick reference as kind of what Dan intended. I understand why these big quotes are there, because it's something you can flip through and just see all of these inspirational quotes and maybe feel a little better about yourself. But sometimes they were a little in my way when I was reading this. I would get in the flow of reading something and then there's just a black page in my way. The one thing that held me back about this book and made me a little bit worrisome is that Dan is a YouTuber. He is an entertainer, not a qualified psychologist. So when I saw that he was coming out with a mental health guide, I was like, ooh, this might not end well. But to my pleasant surprise, Dan actually wrote this alongside of a qualified psychologist. So I guess he would write stuff and then get it approved by the psychologist. So it's not like he just willy-nilly put stuff in here. He had an actual professional look at it, which made me feel so much better. But that in itself also gave me some questions, because there's different types of psychologists. I'm not sure if a lot of people know that. There's different flavors of psychologists, different approaches, if you will. But if you check the back of the book, it says that this psychologist deals with cognitive behavioral therapy, which, not to be biased, is one of my favorite flavors of psychologist. It's probably the category that I fall into if we're going to dive into what I believe and what I believe works. If you don't know what cognitive behavioral therapy is, it's a therapy that has been proven to be highly beneficial, but it deals with both thoughts and behavior. So you're learning tips to deal with your behavior, but also the thoughts thought processes that go along with it. It is not like a behavioralist that will focus on simply behavior and not the thoughts that go along with it. And Lord forbid it's not one of those psychoanalytic freaks, those ones that dive into the subconscious and are very Freudian and ugh. So yes, the fact that this was somebody that was skilled in cognitive behavioral therapy and also a professional made me feel so much better about this book. Another thing I appreciated about this book was kind of the ground rules it set from the get-go, from the very beginning of the book, that kind of stayed throughout the entire thing. Dan has a huge understanding and presses the idea that everyone's going to be different. And that's so true. You know, there's not one cure-all for everybody. What works for somebody will not work at all for another person, and you kind of have to figure out what works for you and what doesn't. Dan also makes the point of everyone has mental health. Again, I feel like as somebody who studies this seems obvious to me, but when you look at it, I don't think a lot of people understand or maybe realize that everyone does have a mental health. I think a lot of people, when they hear mental health, they want to think of the negative stuff, like the disorders and illnesses. And surely that is something we should pay attention to. But, you know, everyone experiences anxiety. Actually, in healthy doses, anxiety is actually a good thing. If we didn't have anxiety, nothing would get done. Everyone at some point in their life is going to experience depression. It is just the way of life and how that works. Now, there is a difference between clinical depression and depression, but we still experience depression at some point in our lives. And Dan is quick to say those things, like even if you feel like you aren't struggling severely, there are things that you can do to benefit from reading this book. And it's like, anybody can read this because everyone has to deal with mental health. And even if you aren't suffering, there are things in this book that can make your situation even slightly better if you read the tomorrow and the days after that kind of thing. So there is a huge understanding throughout the book, and Dan presses this idea of mental health is just a way of life. It's something that we all have. And he even mentions that it's not healthy to ignore the bad feelings for everybody. And another thing that I will kiss this dude for is the fact that he mentioned a couple of times not to glamorize mental illness. Mental health is a very serious thing, and if you have problems with it, that is still a problem. Dan mentions in this book that it's not something to brag about or glamorize. It's a very real thing that a lot of people struggle with. And thank goodness finally somebody said it. It made me so happy to read, because it seems like with social media today, it's like we made it like a cool thing. Like if you're mentally ill, you're cool, and it's like, no. People that actually suffer from these issues are suffering. They don't think it's cool at all. You should go get help. Go seek help. And while it's not something that you should be ashamed of or keep to yourself, you should totally tell someone if you're going through something. It's not something that you should base your entire personality around. It is still a problem and you need help. So the fact that that was said in the book, whew, I love Dan for that. There's a lot of times Dan mentions in this book that if you are having some sort of problem, go speak to a professional if you can. Again, it's one of those things where that is wonderful that he's saying those kinds of things. He even has like a whole section at the end of the book that's dedicated just to therapy and medication and all that stuff. Although he does say that medication should not just be like a quick fix, that you should definitely check other avenues out before you try medication, because medication can be a big thing. I mean, it is a big thing. And I think a lot of people, especially in America, want to just throw pills at you, so it's a quick fix. So the fact that he, once again, is bringing up this topic of check other avenues, but if you need it, obviously go on medication. But yeah, he talks about professionals a lot and seeking professional help, which I understand everyone's in a different circumstance. Not everyone can afford or have the resources to get professional help. But I definitely like that he is pressing that idea of, if you can, go get help, because that is so important. As someone who studies psychology and as someone who is around people who are training to be therapists, there's not a lot that you can say that will shock us. I will say that. Throughout our education and into our careers, we have heard a lot. We have heard a lot of horror stories, and I don't think there's anything that you can say that will surprise us in any way. We're not going to judge you, okay? We have non-judgmental training, okay? I can't judge you. I'm trained not to. Therapists are not scary. As someone who hangs out with a lot of them, they're just like cottagecore little silly girls. They are there to help you. So if you need it, go get a therapist. So if you haven't caught on already, I'm basically saying that Dan is bringing up a lot of stuff that I feel like a lot of people don't say, at least people outside of the psychology field. Another thing that he focuses in on are specific emotions like anger and jealousy. He also brings up the importance of sleep and making friends, which I don't think a lot of people think about when they're thinking about improving their mental health. And I don't know if he realizes it or not, but he does well with an issue that I see a lot of people go through when seeking advice. A lot of people, even seeking professional help, have this understanding of, well, you just don't get it. Like, you don't know what it's like to be in this position. You don't know what it's like to feel this way. Like, who are you to tell me anything when you haven't lived what I lived? And Dan is perfect for this type of thing because he himself has went through depression and anxiety and shares personal stories through that in this book, which I understand is probably therapeutic for him to get all of those feelings out, but at the same time, it kind of lets you in on, like, you're not alone. There's other people, highly successful people, that have gone through similar experiences. He's also not afraid to just call himself out and be hypocritical at times, because I think a lot of self-help books are kind of like assuming that you can live like a saint. You know, it's like, eat right, exercise, do all of this, and it's like they don't really take into consideration that, you know, we're people and we're gonna make mistakes, and even though we know something is good for us, we're not gonna do it all the time. And Dana's unafraid to mention that in his book and be like, this is the advice, even though I don't always follow it. And while it is something that Dan is sharing his story and being someone who is relatable, I think there's also something to be said about the fact that he's a YouTuber. Again, as I said at the beginning of this video, Dan and Phil meant a lot to younger me, and I think they meant a lot to a lot of teenagers during the early 2000s and 10s. I think a lot of people are like me when I kind of refer to Dan as like a comfort YouTuber. He reminds me of being a teenager again, and that in itself makes me feel very safe and good. And so the fact that these words are coming from a comfort person, not to be parasocial, okay, but coming from someone who has meant a lot to me and who I've become and who I was as a teenager, it honestly felt, reading this, it was like a friend giving you advice, like somebody you know. And even if you aren't aware of Dan's internet presence, I think just the way he delivers information is very relatable. He's very casual speaking, like he'll make jokes throughout the whole thing, which makes sense considering his main coping mechanism is humor, but it's very, very easy to read because it's like he's speaking to you. Which, that's the other thing too, is like when you go read about mental health and try to better yourself by researching, it can be very, very difficult if you're not used to reading like academic articles and journals. Some of the language used can be hard to understand, but not in this case. It's easy to use, easy to read. It's almost a bit too easy for me. As I was reading this, it was becoming abundantly clear that I was not the target audience. Not to say that I have not suffered from depression and anxiety, because surely I have. But just the fact that I'm almost too educated to read this book. To me, it was like a watered down psychology 101 class. There wasn't anything in this that I was unfamiliar with. I think after years and years and years of reading academic journals and articles and textbooks and have to study this professionally, I'm just beyond the target audience for this, and that's fine. I understand that. But I also understand that a lot of people who don't study psychology, what seems common sense to me is not for a lot of people. And that's not to say that I'm high and mighty and like, oh, I know things that other people don't. Psychology is not something that's talked about. I mean, we're getting better. I mean, sorta, kind of. TikTok is kind of ruining conversations about mental health, but regardless. Psychology is still a relatively new field. There's a lot of people that don't even consider it a science. And as professionals are still trying to learn about it, it kind of leaves the general public in the dark about a lot of things. And so to that, I say, if you are not a weird psychology nerd like me, I feel like this book can be very, very beneficial. There's a lot of stuff in here that I think could change a lot of people's perspectives. It delivers psychology in a way that's easy to understand from someone who has lived it and experienced what it's like to struggle. And if you're a Dan and Phil fan, you get advice from your favorite parasocial dad. And again, as I said, there's this huge understanding of that this is for everybody. So if you're just looking to better your life, even though you're like, well, I'm not necessarily depressed or anxious, but I just want to live a little better, you can definitely check this out. While there was no new astounding information to me personally, I still enjoyed it a lot. But I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much if it wasn't because of Dan. I don't know, he's just a little silly guy and I like the way he writes. But that was just a couple of my thoughts on You Will Survive This Night by Dan Howell. I know this is different from my usual content, but if you liked the video, please like and subscribe to join the Groovy Graveyard. And as always, I will see you in the next one.